this webcast today with such a distinguished panel, which I'm going to introduce you to shortly. Myself, I'm David Chidgey. I'm in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, and I'm the Shadow Minister for Africa, as well as being a chair of the All-Party Group for Africa. And I have a great interest in the subject, obviously. So let me welcome you to this webcast. This the third AEPI webcast during the COVID-19 pandemic. And today we're going to ask the question, which is absolutely central to everybody's minds. When a vaccine for COVID-19 is available, who's going to get it? Will it be another privilege for the rich? Will it be a white-collar vaccine? That's really why I'm delighted to introduce this panel of champions of global justice and access for medicines in the north and south of the world. Just one important information notice. If audience members can use their questions and answers function to submit questions, please do. We'd like your questions to be put to the panel using the questions and answers function on Zoom. And I'm asking each panelist to keep their opening remarks to 5 minutes so that we can open the meeting to general discussion and questions from our audience. So let me first of all apologize for the fact on behalf of Dr. David Chidgey, the Minister for Health in Ethiopia, who's not been able to join us today. But we hope to bring her back to a future webcast because there's a lot of progressive change happening there in her country. In a moment, we're going to hear from Hoen and Achal Prabhala, I'm so sorry, Prabhala, two of the world's leading campaigners for access to medicines. And we're going to hear from Mr. Saul Walker, who leads the UK's development efforts on COVID-19 treatments in Africa. But first, let me introduce Winnie Byanyima, who has led civil society so passionately in recent decades and is here to talk about the people's vaccine. Winnie.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, yes.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon to the distinguished panelists and to the audience. I'm absolutely delighted that African European Parliamentarians Initiative wants to support making the people's vaccine for COVID-19 a reality. It's going to be a big battle, and we need the parliamentarians to play their part. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on this panel, although I won't be able to stay up to the end, I'm sorry. We are convinced that the time has come for a people's vaccine that is patent-free, free of charge, and available to all people in all countries as a global public good. The same applies for all treatments, diagnostics, and other technologies for COVID-19. Just as for HIV, we need strong leadership, global leadership, engagement, and oversight from parliamentarians in this COVID response. And that's why the support of parliamentarians is critical. Right now, there's a global race to develop the vaccine, as you know. When it is developed and becomes available, it is going to be an even worse struggle, a grab, if I might call it, because this is what we have today. There's a grab for PPE, there's a grab for test kits. Rich countries are stocking up for themselves while poor countries are standing in the back of the queue. It will be worse when a vaccine is found and there is no clear plan on how it will be manufactured and distributed across the world. We saw this with AIDS. When treatments were found, it was the wealthier people in wealthier countries who were treated first, and millions of poor people in poorer countries, such as my own in Uganda, were left waiting and left to die. That's what we cannot have happen now. That's why people's vaccine from the outset, not after months and years of campaigning, must be available. We must resist people in poor countries being forced to wait. So we had this campaign started where 150 world leaders, global experts, joined a call for a vaccine that's a global public good, including people like President Ramaphosa of South Africa, who chairs the African Union and whose country has the highest burden of HIV, so facing two epidemics at the same time. We had the Prime Minister of Pakistan and others sign. So you parliamentarians, if you are in this audience, as I hope you are the champions of the people, you make legislation, you oversee, you adopt, approve the budgets for your countries. In all those roles, you are able to be decisive. Two things happened last week that are a cause for concern for us. One, first, we welcomed very much the European Union leading, bringing many partners, other countries together to pledge $8 billion for the search of a vaccine and treatments and diagnostics. And the language used was exciting, a global public good, fair and equitable. But two developments in the past 2 weeks have made us worry. One was the European Commission statements about an approach to support and to purchase. These were advanced purchasing mechanisms they announced for their member states. And then a second statement by four European countries. Those are France, Germany, Netherlands, and Italy, who spoke actually a better language, but more still a language about an inclusive vaccine alliance and making some positive noises about supplies for Africa. But we were left feeling that both these initiatives are very much about me first, Europeans first, and maybe some crumbs on the table for Africa later. That's not what we mean by a global public good. And we are looking for real commitment to patent-free. We are looking for a commitment to put this in the WHO pool of technologies, both for vaccines, treatments, and other technologies, so that it is shared more equitably with a plan on how manufacturing and distribution will happen. The me first approach has to be discouraged, and we are counting on you, European members of parliament, British members of parliament, to do that, to lead that.
Thank you. Thank you, Winnie, very much indeed. That's a very powerful opening statement. I'm going to turn to Achal Prabhala now, if I may. Achal, you know the reality of vaccines in India, in Africa, and the global south. Can you take a few moments to describe the reality on the ground and how we can all fight this battle to ensure there is greater success? Achal.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to say about vaccines and public health is that where I live in Bangalore, I work in South Africa, Brazil, and India, but I live in Bangalore. And one of the things that's come to light in the coronavirus pandemic is that there are 1,500 infant deaths per day due to a lack of vaccination. Now, it should be said that not all of those deaths are because of the price of the vaccine itself, but the price of the vaccine plays a very large role in thwarting access to these vaccines by, in this case, the children, very, very young children and sometimes newborn infants who need these vaccines. The second thing I'd like to say is that the reason we're here at all and discussing a vaccine for COVID-19 or the multiple candidates that are under trial is because COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic is a disease that affects rich people. It affects all Etonians, and really that's why we're here. And this is important because right now, all over East Africa, in India, in many parts of South Asia, there are tens of millions of people who could use a vaccine for hookworm infection, for elephantiasis. There are people who could use treatments for dengue and chikungunya. But there are these vast numbers of diseases that kill vast numbers of people whose only fault is that they are poor. And as a result of which, there is no market to, no commercial incentive by Western pharmaceutical companies to make to invest in treatments and vaccines for these diseases. When we think about vaccines in the public imagination, I think that there's a misconception that vaccines are somehow both a global public good, which they are, as well as somehow in the non-profit sector, that vaccines in fact don't actually make money, they're dispensed by governments, or that they are created by institutions who don't have profit at their center. Unfortunately, that hasn't been true since the 1950s. In the 1950s, Jonas Salk, a vaccine pioneer, developed the first polio vaccine, and in fact was one of the people who developed one of the first flu vaccines as well, which we don't know quite as clearly as we know his role in creating the polio vaccine. When he was asked by a famous US broadcaster, Ed Murrow, as to why he didn't patent the vaccine, Jonas Salk laughed, and that clip is available for wide public viewing. He said, I hadn't even thought of it. Look, it belongs to the public. Can you patent the sun? And I think that a powerful statement like that has resonated so much that in fact it has obscured how the vaccine market has changed over the years. And one striking example of how the vaccine market works today is something called PCV13. It stands for the pneumococcal vaccine against pneumonia, which is something that's essential for everyone who lives in the world. In India, we get the pneumococcal vaccine at a discounted price through Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance. It costs about $10 for the government to buy it. That is still over 20 times the cost of their next most expensive vaccine. So they simply cannot afford to buy enough. We have 127,000 deaths due to a lack of affordability of this vaccine in this country. And pneumonia has been a preventable condition since the 1980s. Across sub-Saharan Africa, across South Asia, across poor parts of the world, there are hundreds and thousands of people who die from lack of access to a vaccine which has existed now for about 8 years in its present form from a disease which has been completely preventable for 40 years. And I think it's something that we must take note of. The very last point I want to make in the 30 seconds that I have left is that a number of the, roughly 30 seconds, a number of the access initiatives that are coming out now that we hear about on treatments and vaccines, we need to be suspicious of because they don't cover the whole world. And they're particularly bad at thinking about poor people rather than looking at the very poorest countries in the world and giving out little bits of charity. We need to be involved in the process so that we can make sure that it reaches poor people wherever they live, whether it's in a highly unequal middle-income country like Brazil, or indeed actually even in a country like the United States, which we now understand clearly has vast swathes of poor people who cannot afford high prices for medicines when the government doesn't pay for it. Thank you.
Achal, thank you very much indeed for that breath of reality, which I think is so important in this discussion. Now, I should be talking to Saul Walker, but I'm not sure whether he's actually come and joined us yet. No answer? Ah, no. Okay, thank you, Kieran. In that case, I'll move straight on to Ellen, if I may. Ellen, I can see very clearly in the top right-hand corner of my screen. And Ellen, you know, what do you make of the contributions we've had so far? And what do you make of the change in the range of global initiatives? For example, ACT, the People's Vaccine, and CTAP. Can you guide us through these initiatives and their chances of success in your view?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me on this panel to discuss these issues that are in enormously rapid development, because the various global initiatives that are developing or expanding or changing is truly mind-boggling. What is absolutely crucial is the fact that in a fairly short period of time, so much public financing has been pledged towards innovations needed for COVID-19, vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Because that's where part of the the answer lies. To answer the question, how do we get from the rhetoric of global public good, the people's vaccine, no one should own the vaccines. This is the language, as Winnie pointed out, the language that world leaders were using when they introduced their pledges at the pledging conference under the leadership of the European Commission. Close to 10 billion euro has been brought together, and that money is now being spent on research and development of new tools that are necessary. But the question is, how can we assure that these new tools, once they become available, indeed are equitably distributed and will be available to all? That is not going to happen automatically. For that, action needs to be taken now. As Winnie pointed out, there are very important lessons to be learned from HIV, where it took almost a decade for the effective antiretroviral medicines to become available to the vast majority of people living in developing countries with HIV. We need to learn from that. There were all kinds of barriers, financial, regulatory, patent barriers stood in the way of assuring that people had access to antiretrovirals. In 2010, the Medicines Patent Pool was established to offer relief for many people living with HIV through ensuring that the intellectual property would be available for low-cost production of cheaper antiretrovirals. But that was a decade, maybe 2 decades, 2 decades too late. So the approach to access to essential new COVID-19 medical technologies cannot be based on a country-by-country or case-by-case approach. We need to have global approaches. We've heard Angela Merkel speak of global public good. We've heard Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, talking about no one can own the vaccine, but that is speech. Their actions don't really mirror that, and that is indeed of great concern. Now, there's one, I think, a very important initiative and a very important development is the very swift action by the World Health Organization upon proposal by Costa Rica, established on June the 1st, the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. Its short name is CTAP, and it is set up to gather the patents and all other forms of intellectual property, such as know-how, knowledge, data, trade secrets, software, etc., necessary to expand the development and the production of essential health tools needed in the response to the pandemic. This pool, however, is a voluntary mechanism. Countries, national governments have the option to take non-voluntary measures to, for example, force their industries to do certain things or force their industries to share knowledge or patents, for example. But at the international level, that is much more difficult. There is no legal instrument to do that. But what we do have is many countries spending vast amounts of public financing on the development of these new tools. So the success of CTAP will depend on the political support it will receive. So far, 38 countries have endorsed the solidarity call to action that established CTAP. But what would be important now is that the public money allocated for the development of the new drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics comes with strings attached. And in particular, the requirement that the awardees of this money share the knowledge that they develop with this public money, that they share this knowledge with the WHO COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. And here, of course, parliamentarians and national parliaments are going to have to play a very, very key role. They can help make that happen by ensuring that the public investments made today lead to public benefits for all in a spirit of global solidarity. And the mechanism exists now, but we now need the political will and the political action to make sure that that mechanism can deliver. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Helen. Well, I'm sorry we don't seem to manage to pick up with Saul Walker yet, but I'm going to carry on regardless. And just to recap what we have so far, if I may, on the different initiatives we've got out there. The ACT Accelerator, which started in April as a meeting of the heads of state from across the world, but not the USA. The People's Vaccine, a campaign led by UNAIDS and Oxfam. The Solidarity Call to Action, which was supported by some but not all European governments at the World Health Assembly in May. And the WHO Technology Pool, or CTAP, which sounds very promising and would really place binding conditions on new treatments so that they are for people, not for profit. Well, I was going to ask Mr. Walker to have a chat about that, but we'll have to wait for him. Winnie and Achal, how do you see these initiatives from an African and Indian perspective? Perhaps, Achal, you'd like to start first, if you would.
Absolutely. So I genuinely believe that the CTAP that Ellen was just describing is the world's best shot at getting equitable access to vaccines and treatments. It's also the world's best shot at actually reaching treatments and vaccines. A number of people have pointed out that there is something deeply contradictory that's going on in all these massive amounts of money that are being thrown at pharmaceutical companies, thrown through Gavi and CEPI, the Vaccines Alliance, and the Center for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, which are the two big power brokers, if you will, of this pandemic. All this money that's being thrown at companies is being done so competitively in order to get them to compete with each other to come up with vaccines. We instead can cooperate. There is a faster way to reach treatments and vaccines that require using multiple technologies that sometimes involve others' monopolies that when you work competitively, you simply cannot do. The other problem, however, is the fact that vaccines really do make a lot of money. So the pneumonia vaccine that I was talking about, for instance, is Pfizer's single largest revenue earning product. It brings them $5 billion every single year. And the truth is, in this coronavirus pandemic, in a situation where every single person on this planet is similarly affected, is not going to be, is not going to necessarily have similar outcomes depending on your class and income, but is definitely similarly affected, are we going to allow the same rules that have, in fact, delivered AIDS medicines 8 years too late to sub-Saharan Africa, that have not actually delivered access to a number of different crucial vaccines and treatments? Are we going to allow those same rules to produce the treatments and vaccines we need to exit this pandemic? The answer must be no, and the only available mechanism that can really make that work is the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP. It is absolutely essential.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Winnie, would you like to now add something to this? This is becoming a very interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to your views as well on this.
Thank you. There are two arguments here. One is a moral argument. We cannot allow that where you live determines whether you will live. I don't think anyone wants a world like that. There is a moral argument that we all lives should be valued. So that we must keep at the center of all our actions, that every life is valuable. Then secondly, there is the argument, if I may say, an instrumentalist argument, an argument for profit, like Achal has just said, that there's a lot of money to make. But even within that argument, this is public money that is being pumped, given to pharmaceuticals, to scientists in research institutions to rush and find treatments, vaccines, whatever. And it's public money. I might be an African woman and not paying taxes in the UK or in France, but I have a right to speak about accountability. This public money must result into public good. It can't be to drive the profits of some companies, some people who happen to be owners of capital and technology. So there is also an argument there about the resources and the public benefit that must result from them. Then the thirdly is that Corona has shown us more than ever before that you're only as safe as everybody else is safe, that your health depends on the health of others. So it's futile to have a me-first approach of I'll get for my people when your borders are open for trade and tourism and everything, and we are one planet. So I would say that we need everybody on board to argue for the human rights argument, but also the instrumentalist argument that for anyone to be safe, everybody must be safe and public resources must be used for public good.
Thank you very much, Winnie. I'm going to come to Ellen now for me, because isn't it simply the case, Ellen, that the US is blocking these initiatives because it wants to protect the intellectual property laws and the American pharmaceutical industry? Is that oversimplification, or is that behind it all?
Well, I think what we see from the United States in a very open and very blunt manner is America first. That doesn't necessarily mean all Americans first, because I don't think the current administration really cares about the well-being of most of its people. Yeah. It is very much the rich first, and the United States has taken some extraordinary activities to achieve that. For example, the US administration attempted to buy up a Europe-based vaccine development corporations in order to of a candidate that they thought would be a winner. So this is the exact opposite of a solidarity approach. Mm-hmm. So this is very problematic, and let's hope that after November different winds will start to blow from the United States. But it is not just an America first issue, because we also see in Europe even the solidarity within the European Union breaking down very, very rapidly, where countries going alone or forming small coalitions for placing pre-orders of vaccines that, let's keep in mind, that do not yet exist. So there is currently a real disconnect between the language being used by politicians and the political acts that they take, and we need to hold them accountable. And the key to that, indeed, is the public money, because at the end of the day, all of this is done with our collective resources. And again, that's where parliaments come in, ask how that money is spent and whether that is spent towards greater solidarity or towards the opposite.
Thank you. And before, Achal has indicated he'd like to come in, but before I let him in, I'd like to pose a question from the audience, which you might like to address at the same time. And the question is that in terms of agency, who will bring about change? We can talk about change, but who will deliver real change for vaccines in Africa? And you can couple that with another question: what actions can national parliamentarians now take to help CTAP and other mechanisms for equitable access to vaccines and technologies?
Mm-hmm.
Achal first. I think I need to see what your turn to do.
Sure. Thank you. I wanted to follow up on your question and to what Ellen just said.
Yes.
When Winnie started out speaking about the inexcusable delay of 8 to 10 years in moving medicines, life-saving medicines, across 12,000 kilometers. It takes 16 hours to fly that distance. It took 8 years for those medicines to reach Johannesburg. I think that I think that the one of the interesting things there that comes out of that argument is the nature of the current system. This is what the current system is designed to do. It's not a fault of the current system. It's a feature of the current system. And we have to be able to tweak the system, or at best radically alter the system in order to deliver access at this stage. When we think of the United States administration, because it's so much in the news in terms of defunding the WHO or various other egregious actions that it's taken, I think that we forget what European countries are doing. And I want to highlight and build on the example that Ellen pointed out, that Winnie also mentioned in her opening statement. There is something called the Inclusive Vaccines Alliance. This is the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Italy. What they're doing is actually forming a cartel in order to buy vaccines up in advance for themselves. When we think of the AIDS crisis, you know, I just personally think, I worked in South Africa for the trade union on these issues in 2004. You would imagine that what we learned today is the right thing to do. Instead, what's happened is that companies and countries, rich companies and rich countries, they've merely learned the right thing to say. So imagine the perversity of calling this cartel to form another supply avenue to buy advanced supplies of your medicines, the Inclusive Vaccines Alliance. Imagine the fact that Gilead, all of these other companies who have treatments have said, we're going to operate at cost. We're not going to make any profit off of this. So in the last 3 months, since remdesivir first showed promise as a treatment, which is to date the only approved US Food and Drug Administration approved treatment, the market capitalization of Gilead has increased by $14 billion. So it's not a question of profiting off the pandemic, it's a question of having profited already from the pandemic. This has happened, the profits have happened.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Winnie is indicating, I think, if I could put it this way, that she'd like to comment on your last remarks. But before I do, Winnie, can I just say, one of the very interesting passages of the People's Vaccines letter, led by your good self and UNAIDS, is the passage which calls for transparency and oversight. Yes. And I want to quote, transparent democratic governance is essential to lock in accountability for this agreement. So what can we do as members of parliament and citizens to make this happen? How can we hold governments to account?
Absolutely. There are concrete things that parliamentarians can do. I think the first one is to insist that these funds that have been pledged behind certain initiatives like the ACT Accelerator initiative to align and endorse the WHO COVID-19 technology pool to ensure that funding that's coming from your countries to universities, to pharma, to other agencies, comes with conditions to pool the know-how, the science, the technologies there. That conditionality, I think you have the power of the purse as parliamentarians to insist that your money contributed comes with conditions that the initiatives are aligned to this WHO COVID technology pool that's for all. That's one. I also would like that parliamentarians then also take their oversight role very, very seriously, demand full accountability from pharma about their costs. So often they are not transparent. Their R&D costs are hidden and taken together with other costs, and then you cannot know to what extent they've been publicly funded. And how do you discount that in terms of what they want to gain from their patent right or their patent? So their transparency about what they have taken from the public is critical. And again, it's parliaments that can help us achieve that.
Thank you, Winnie. You reminded me very strongly of some of the irritating comments, if I may say so, by our own government in England in response to the financial impact of COVID. Time and time again, our Prime Minister talks about the government has given so many millions for this. The government has given so millions for that. Never does it come across that it's actually our money he's distributing. And your point, of course, is absolutely spot on. I want ministers to say, we've given some of your money for this cause. Isn't that right? Anyway, Ellen, it's about time we heard from you on these points. Could you like to join us now on that one?
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, even the money that is spent on the development of pharmaceuticals through high drug prices, through paying for highly priced medicines, is at the end of the day our money. In fact, all of the money that goes around in the pharmaceutical industry is public money at the end of the day. And that, if you think about it like that, then the question who gets to decide how that money is being spent becomes a very different one. But of course, the reality is not like that. But with COVID-19, we have an opportunity, I think, to get things right and do things very differently. To the question of what can parliamentarians do? Well, first of all, parliamentarians can ask and urge the government to support the COVID-19 technology access pool, and say you endorse the solidarity call for action as close to 40 countries have already done. And what's encouraging is that it is a mix of very, very high income countries and very poor countries. It's clearly across the globe. Then that would need to be followed by saying, putting your signature on that piece of paper is not enough. Now we want to see your strategy of what are you going to do to make sure that technologies that are being developed are shared through this pool. So that would be the second. For countries that directly spend financing on the development of innovation, parliamentarians could ensure that there are strings attached to this money. As you quite rightly pointed out, David, it's the public's money. So what kind of conditions are attached to that? How is global solidarity assured? But I would also urge parliamentarians to look at Plan B, because if the pool for some reason does not work, because its weakness is the fact that it is voluntary, you can of course through all kinds of policies sort of steer the holders of the intellectual property into doing the right thing. But if that does not happen, and if companies, for example, would refuse to sharing their intellectual property, governments can actually intervene. You can step in and say, we're going to give others the right to use that patent, for example. That can be done through compulsory licensing. A number of countries are sharpening their compulsory licensing legislation as we speak. So that is another area where parliamentarians can see, assess your patent law. Is your compulsory licensing provision easy enough to use? Is your Minister of Health, does he or she have the power to invoke a compulsory license? So to sharpen that, I think the sharper compulsory licensing legislation we have, also the higher the chances that the pool will be successful. And last but not least is the theme of transparency. Winnie also spoke to that. Demand greater transparency, demand transparency with regard to where the money goes to, who gets it, demand transparency from corporations that develop these tools, to be able to assess whether the non-for-profit pricing that is being promised is indeed non-for-profit pricing. Because if a company like Johnson & Johnson has said, we're going to price the vaccine at 10 euros, and they were very proud of that. Well, I think 10 euros is a very high price for a vaccine that potentially has a demand of 7 billion. That will make a lot of people terribly, terribly rich. But it also means that a lot of people will not have access to it. But even if it is a non-for-profit price, which they claim it is, how are we supposed to assess that if there's no transparency with regard to the costing and with regard to who paid what? So the transparency is very important. That also relates to these various initiatives. How are decisions being made? How are decisions made of the allocation of the money in these various vaccine initiatives, for example? And for all of these issues, parliamentarians can play and have to play a very key role, I think.
Thank you, Helen. I've had a couple of questions coming from our audience. If I'm just going to put those in now, because obviously engaging with our wider audience is so important. Firstly, we've had a question asking, are there initiatives to bring scientists from both global north and south currently engaged in research together to produce vaccines? And another question, I'll throw them together, is what organization has the responsibility or the power to encourage global cooperation on the equitable distribution of vaccines? With the US withdrawing from WHO, does the UN take over? Now then, I leave it to your good selves. Who would like to come in first on that? Achal.
Sure. I think there is something that's very interesting that's going on with who gets to decide how vaccines and treatments are distributed equitably. The WHO CTAP has proposed taking a leading role in delivering that kind of equitable access. It's a multilateral solution. It involves every single country in the world. But in fact, the organizations that are driving that at the moment are Gavi and CEPI. The pharmaceutical industry, when you ask the pharmaceutical industry what they're doing about access, their answers typically involve these two words, Gavi and CEPI. We've handed it over to the Center for Epidemic Preparedness and the Global Vaccines Alliance. Now, the problem with what Gavi and CEPI are doing is that they're not member-based multilateral organizations. They are nonprofit institutions that work without the same degree of transparency and participation. So for instance, there is something called the COVAX AMC. This is a vaccines advanced market commitment mechanism into which rich countries primarily invest in order to secure a set of, in the hundreds of millions of doses of whichever vaccines Gavi is further investing in for their own population. Now, the problem with it is that they have set up a few different ways to get access to other people. They've enlisted the Serum Institute, which is a private generic vaccine manufacturer in India. Now, the problem is we have at least 21 other certified vaccine manufacturers. It's not clear why one has been selected over the other or why not all of them have been put to use. Not very much about how many doses are going to be produced and for which countries and at what prices has been released. And in this kind of a pandemic, using public money, I hesitate to say our money because I don't pay taxes in the UK or the EU, but it's your money. And you know, for it to be discharged in such a callous manner without any degree of transparency, where sometimes even the heads of states, I very much that number 10 Downing Street actually understands all of the workings of the many investments that they have made in Gavi. And I mean that seriously. Even for the British population, it is not entirely clear if I was in the UK as to how I'd get access to it. Much less what that British investment is doing to deny access to other people elsewhere. It's not a conscious choice that British taxpayers are making, but it's a choice that the government is making on their behalf. And I think that there needs to be a much greater call for transparency at these institutions, particularly Gavi and CEPI, which are funded by public money and are working for the public interest in general, but just not taking the world enough into account in their decisions.
You make a very interesting point, if I may say so. It's a huge public announcement by the government of the last round of the Gavi, if you remember, and it was incredibly successful. Well, I think it was $8 billion was committed, and I think it was fair to say that the UK's contribution was incredible, really. But nobody asked the question: now what happens with it? Anyway, Winnie is looking to me with eager anticipation. I think you'd like to make a comment, Winnie, but please come in.
Thank you. I wanted to run away much earlier, but this is such an important
You're very kind.
Achal and Ellen. Achal just said something important about Gavi and CEPI and how they work. Gavi has recently announced its new vaccine advanced market commitment. This seems to have been quite, and this is after the big pledging that was so successful and public money from all the major donors put in, as well as private foundations money. And they announced this vaccine advanced market commitment. It seemed to have been rushed. It seems to have actually even bypassed their board. But it just seems that these organizations need to be more transparent about how intellectual property issues are handled and decided upon. We all need to know how their decisions are made, but it's disturbing when you hear that even the board is kind of sidestepped and decisions are made that are about people's lives. So I just want to agree very much with Achal that these two organizations that benefit from huge resources, taxpayers' money, and taxpayers are looking for solutions for themselves, which are tied to solutions for everybody else in the world, should be discussed publicly and transparently.
Well, it's very interesting. You know, we seem to have a situation where all of us want to increase access, but we see different ways of doing it. So it's a question I'd like to ask all the panelists, after I've asked one from Helen. Could we look at this question another way and ask you what you think will actually happen over the months ahead? What are the most realistic outcomes, and who will be the most important institutions or actors in deciding what happens next? And Ellen, if I could just say to yourself, do you think this is a moment where governments can finally break through, as the Dutch almost did in 2016, and break the shackles of IP and patent law? Is this to be a moment of transformative change? Helen.
Yeah, sorry, my mute button was gone for a moment. Great moment of panic. I think the situation we're in, because of the global nature of this pandemic, the fact that this is affecting everyone, every single one of us, wherever we are, it has the potential to also bring out the best in us and actually design ways to do things differently. It would require moving away a bit from using the institutions that are very much based on the principle the rich countries will fend for themselves, we don't really need to worry about them, and we're going to do something nice for some of the poor countries, because that is very much, that is in the access to medicines world been very much the sort of the model. But this is, here we are in this together. No one knows where the vaccine will come from, for example. Trump may think that the Germans have to have the best shot at coming up with the vaccine, but it might be China, or a collaboration of institutions from various countries. So in a way, it is in everyone's interest to get ahead of the game and do things differently. So yes, I think there is a potential. This crisis has the potential of showing that you can do things very differently. And already, of course, no one has said from day one of this pandemic, oh, well, we trust the market. We could just sit back and wait for the pharmaceuticals to come up with all the tools that we need. No, the first response was, whoa, we're going to have to spend a lot of money. We need to get in the lead. Governments need to step up. And that is that in itself can be transformative, because it shows that you make things happen in the field of pharmaceutical innovation directly by setting the agenda, by setting the priorities, and by putting the money towards those priorities. When you do that, you need to also set the next step and say, since we're doing that, whoever comes up with it, does not end up the entity in control of deciding who will get the vaccine and at what price. That then also becomes a matter of public policy. And again, that would have to be global public policy in a multilateral setting. And I think the WHO plays an incredibly important role. There's a lot of talk about the US leaving the WHO, but I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon, just because of the rules and the way the Constitution is written. The US actually can't really leave the WHO until a year from now. So, and they haven't sent a formal letter yet that they are going to do that. So that may never happen. And while we're waiting for regime change in the United States, I think the rest of the world should get together and work on the basis of global consensus -1, and work towards getting together more closely in this spirit of solidarity. So this is my most optimistic assessment. There are moments like last week, as you know, looking at these what Achal called the cartel move, where sadly my own country is part of. Then of course the courage sinks. I think this is a Dutch expression. The courage sinks in your shoes. You think, oh my God, this is going entirely in the wrong direction. But here again, the politicians, members of parliament, but also civil society is an incredibly important role for civil society organizations to keep demanding from our governments and from our politicians to take the to support the solidarity call and not do the opposite. So various actors, non-governmental actors, play a big role in that as well.
Thank you very much. Just as I think probably on the same theme, but slightly different perspective. What do we learn from the historic campaigns for other illnesses, including HIV/AIDS, and that we can positively bring forward to this issue of COVID-19? How do we get the Americans and the farmers on board for HIV treatment? I wonder, Achal, if you'd like to comment on that.
I'd love to very much. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about for a while since the coronavirus pandemic started is how the health of each of us is crucially dependent on the health of all of us, right? And I think that we think this anew in the coronavirus pandemic, as though this is something that's just come up. As though that's never been true, but in fact, it really has always been true. It's been through the AIDS epidemic. It's been through the many decades that we've lived with tuberculosis, a disease that kills 1,200 people a day in India. So in fact, what I find almost absurd about the vaccine nationalism on display in these last few weeks is how ineffective that old form of nationalism is at dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And let me just explain that to the extent it matters. The flu shot that we all take, there is a flu vaccine. There are vaccines against existing known coronaviruses we've lived with longer. They reduce your risk of catching the flu. They don't eliminate your risk of catching the flu. And we don't know what shape the COVID-19 vaccines might take. And it could well be that the way the vaccines work, at least initially, is similarly to reduce one's risk rather than eliminate it. And so there is something perverse about vaccine nationalism, because it's fine if the United States is able to secure enough doses of multiple different vaccines on the market. But truly, I think Winnie pointed this out earlier, unless the United States is planning to borders permanently closed to visitors from every low-income country, or not have its own citizens and residents travel to said low-income countries, the only national solution that can truly work is an international solution. This problem is not going to go away in the richest enclaves in the United States until it goes away in the poorest parts of India and sub-Saharan Africa. And so there is something absurd about the way it's playing out that I do think one should be pointing out.
Thank you very much. I've got a message to say that Saul is now in. I don't know whether Simon can help me on that one.
Hi, Lord Chidgey.
Ah, you are. Hello there. How are you?
I'm well. I was having some internet problems, but it does seem to be working now.
Well, I'm delighted to see you, of course, and to introduce you to the rest of our guests, who, of course, are visible on the screen here. But I'm not sure how much of the discussion you've been able to hear, if any.
I've literally just joined, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for coming in. I'm going to try, if our other guests would allow me, to try and pick up a couple of points that I might ask you. I'm sure Ellen, you, I think, know Saul from way back, maybe, or not so way back. But so I'm going to ask you maybe to put a couple of questions to us, which Saul might like to answer. There's a couple of points. I'm just going through my notes, which of course are now slightly out of order. But I think the main concern is, and I think I'm going to get Ellen to come on this. We've been talking at great length about two particular themes. One is to get other governments and other countries to work together and not to have self-interest or national interest at the fore. And the other point, I think, was that how do we feel that we can rationalize and regulate the approach of industry, farmers, whatever, to the distribution of vaccines to the most needy, and probably in many cases the most likely to be unable to access the vaccines because of cost. So we see a role. I think it's right to say we see a role for governments here to take on some responsibility for fairness and accessibility. That's my perspective. Maybe Ellen, you'd like to add to that. I've given you a chance to think about that now.
Hi, Saul. It's great to see you again.
Hi, Ellen.
It's the wonders of Zoom bring so many old friends back into my living room. Well, it's actually my closet, but you know, you see what I'm saying. We had quite a bit of discussion on the role of government, of course, and what governments can do to help some of the new initiatives to advance. And I would be particularly interested in the role of the UK government in supporting the WHO COVID-19 technology access pool, which was announced by the WHO on the 1st of June. A number of high-income countries, low, middle-income countries have supported that call, including a number of European countries, but the UK has not, and I would like to hear from you what the plans are from the UK to support that pool and support also policies and strategies to make sure that new COVID-19 medical innovations are indeed shared through that mechanism.
Would you like, Saul, to add to that your statement that you were making when we started this webinar, or
I mean,
of it?
So I was basically going to say, do we have the Ministry of Health joining or not?
No, sadly, she couldn't do that.
Okay. So I was just going to say what an august panel of that I'm on, but that still holds true. So I was going to just talk about the scale of the challenge, obviously the impact in Africa, you know, the secondary impacts, just very briefly through that. Talk a little bit about vaccines being a game changer, that we're trying to do something in 12 to 18 months that usually would take 10 years. And we need to take forward multiple vaccines in parallel, and we need to scale up manufacturing capacity before we know which is going to work. So we've got to bear a whole lot more risk than we usually do. Collaboration is essential, clearly, in doing that. Talk a little bit about the partnerships we're already seeing form under the COVAX initiative, particularly with WHO, but industry as well, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, Gavi, and so on. Talk a little bit about the COVAX AMC that was launched on the 4th of June, that's raised 563 million. And then something about the agreements that have already been struck with AstraZeneca, Gavi, and CEPI, which will make up to 1.3 billion doses of vaccine available in starting this year, but going into 2021 at an affordable price. And actually, Astra is going to do that at a not-for-profit price. So then just kind of finish up a little bit about us engaging in the ACT Accelerator. We've been part of the facilitation group that's been working there. We're a major funder of all of the organizations that are leading it. And the Prime Minister obviously has basically said this is going to be the most urgent shared endeavour of our times to develop a vaccine and to get it to everyone who needs it. And I just wanted to end with that. There's an old African proverb of go fast by yourself, but go far together. But actually here, we need to go far and fast together. That's the scale of what we need to do.
Thank you very much.
So that's the opening statement.
Well, may I just take that one stage further? I want to make a comment to Simon, because recognizing the fact that you've had this problem this morning. Simon, are we recording this conversation? Will it be available? And the question is put to you on the basis of if we could get that recording to Saul, there will be an opportunity, should they wish, for him and his colleagues to respond to the written or rather the recorded version of our conversation, because we've not really had an opportunity to contribute, which we would have obviously much appreciated. But having said that, I think if we could ask, Achal, would you like to respond to the points that Saul was making?
Yes, I'd like to very much, actually. Hi, Saul, and welcome. We're having what I could describe maybe as a robust conversation here about government investment, particularly by European countries, commitments and obligations that are entailed within those investments, and ways in which the national question is dealt with in connection with the global question. And I have a couple of broad questions for you. I don't want to put you on the spot, but you are using, obviously, taxpayer money in the United Kingdom to fund a range of different private pharmaceutical for-profit companies that have treatments or vaccine candidates under trial and that show promise. Why is it that you would do that without imposing conditions on them that would ease what you certainly know would be the very restrictive multiple layers of monopoly control they would have on those vaccines and treatments that would obviously then make it much harder for different suppliers around the world to make them at competitive and equitable prices? That's the first question. And the second question is, if you understand fully what your investment in Gavi will entail, not just for the UK, but for me, who I work in India and South Africa and Brazil, I would very much like you to explain that.
Okay, well, on the first point, the investment that DFID makes into this area, so through CEPI and through Gavi, that does come with access conditions. And you know what Gavi already does. And you know, the vaccine summit on the 4th of June raised $8.4 billion, which will vaccinate over 300 million of the most vulnerable children across the world in the next 5 years. So, I mean, that's what Gavi does. The work we put into CEPI, the 250 million we put into CEPI is trying to manage a portfolio of 9 to 10 vaccine candidates as quickly as possible, and includes in its discussions with partners that it works with access conditions. So, I mean, that's what CEPI is there to do. We are dealing with an unprecedented global pandemic here. And so it's inevitable that we have to balance these national and these international requirements. And that's just true. It's true for India, it's true for Brazil, it's true for the UK, it's true for everywhere. But I think the UK has been very clear that through our investments in CEPI and in Gavi, that we do want to do both. We want to make sure the UK population gets the vaccines that it needs. And you said, you know, taxpayers' money, taxpayers will expect that to be the case. But we also want to do at the same time, which is why we also invest in CEPI and Gavi, that we want to do that at a global level and be as equitable as possible, as quickly as possible. Right? And that's a huge, unprecedented challenge that we have to do.
Saul, a very quick question. So David is here on the panel. He's a UK taxpayer as well. Yep. I'm not a taxpayer in Europe or the UK, but I wonder if the basis of the UK getting access to doses of a vaccine necessarily has to mean that a range of poor people in other countries, especially middle-income countries, let's say, need to be excluded. No, one sec. Let me just finish. It's not a contentious question. So, and I apologize if my tone is coming off as being something that's worrying you. I don't mean to upset you, but what I do mean to do is to ask you a serious question, which we've not had answers to, right? The best manner in which access to a vaccine or a treatment, and you know this clearly, would be facilitated is by harnessing the manufacturing capacity of vaccine companies and drug manufacturers across the world, right? And you've seen what Gavi has announced through much of the money that has been pledged, especially at the last summit. They've engaged a few of them, not all of them. Those are done through deals that are not necessarily transparent. We don't know what those deals are. When Gavi says, I promise you access, that access has not been delivered historically in, for instance, the case of pneumonia on the PCV13 vaccine. Partly because Gavi does not use any of the leverage in terms of the huge money that it invests in Pfizer, which makes this drug, to necessarily remove any of the intellectual property monopolies that Pfizer enforces on said vaccine. So I do hope that you can at least understand our distrust in agreements that are not transparent, that we don't know the details of, and our distrust in the historical record of institutions like Gavi to deliver access without dismantling any of the barriers that have prevented access in the last few decades.
I think you've made your point. Perhaps we're running short of time now, actually. I'm sorry. I'd like to give Saul the opportunity to respond if he wishes to those points. Can I just say one thing? You're talking about the awareness, if you like, of the public in my country here of the difficulties of coping with this, responding to this worldwide pandemic. I think the important point said politically a few weeks ago was that this pandemic affects the people of the world, and we are as reliable and linked to the people of the world as they are to us. So it is a universal problem looking for a universal solution, which I thought was the right thing to say from a parliamentarian's point of view. Back to you, Saul.
So I agree with that. I mean, and our Secretary of State has regularly said that unless we do this together, we will not succeed. And that includes ending a pandemic. In the end, this is a pandemic. Unless we see global recovery and economic recovery, we will not get beyond this and the huge impact that it's having. Just to come back on Gavi, I mean, on the pneumo vaccines, the AMC on pneumo was a success. It brought forward the availability of vaccines very, very rapidly to roll out pneumococcal vaccines across the world. And, you already know that 50%, more than 50% of Gavi's vaccines are actually purchased from India, particularly from the Serum Institute of India. So India and other developing country manufacturers have played a huge role in what Gavi does. You talk about the IP issue, and we've had a long discussion about what IP means in access to medicines. Ellen and I have talked about this for many years. On the vaccine side, there is a particular challenge in terms of the know-how that's required to go to scale. It's not just about the patents. You have to have the know-how. You also have to have the regulatory capacity to manage the vaccines at scale and to do all of the regulatory clearances, the batch clearances, everything else that you need to do. You need all of those things to do. India does that very well. And actually they've just bought in, Serum have just bought in a new pneumococcal vaccine as well. So the AMC has bought in additional players into that market. So, we have to work with, I agree, actually, internationally, the vaccines market is hugely, hugely concentrated. I don't think that is particularly to do or just to do with patents. There are a range of other reasons why that's the case. Partly the market entry costs are very, very high to get into vaccines at scale. There's probably only 6 or 7 big multinational companies plus a number of the Indian manufacturers that actually produce at the kinds of scales that we need for global access at the moment. And that is a peculiarity of this field, and we should try to expand that over time. And actually Gavi and its work it does with developing country manufacturers is trying to do some of that. So we do need that market should evolve over time, but we are where we are at the moment. And to actually go as fast and as at scale we need now for COVID-19, actually now is the time to make sure we have those multinational companies working with us.
Thank you very much, Saul. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we are running out of time. I know that Ellen, you'd like to have a word. I'm going to have to make it the final word before calling in Simon to quickly sum up, if you can, in a few minutes, what we've achieved in our discussion today. So, Ellen, to you first, and then.
Yeah, I can be very quick. I think it's important to remind ourselves that the vaccine vaccine delivery has not always been the core activity of commercial companies. It used to be a government's responsibility, and vaccines, the production of development and the production of vaccines was a core government responsibility. And perhaps this COVID-19 crisis will bring that back, but that then also needs to come with good international arrangements for the distribution. I have not heard, Saul, you respond to my question. What is the UK's position on CTAP? Because CTAP actually is not a patent pool. It acknowledges that you need to know how the data, the transfer of technology, all of that will be facilitated. It doesn't only look at vaccines, also therapeutics and diagnostics. And it is for the moment disregarded by CEPI, but the government supporting CEPI, of course, could help move that around. And I was wondering whether the UK is going to do anything like that.
So at the moment, we're not signed up to the CTA, as you know. We support many of the aims of the CTA, and we already have been involved in supporting some of the initiatives there. The medicine patent pool, the UK was one of the countries that helped establish that back 10 years ago. There are some areas within there that across government there are concerns around. Some vagueness around potentially new policy requirements in countries which are unclear, and obligations that it's not clear whether they relate to governments or to private agencies and other agencies, and it's not clear what we would be taking on and as an obligation when actually those obligations belong to others. So I think there are those things that, although we share the overall objectives, which is to get vaccines globally as quickly as possible, there are some concerns around some of the policy language in the statement at the moment. However, having said that, we continue to do things that actually are practical ways to scale up vaccines now and make sure that vaccines get to people as quickly as possible. So, I think we should be judged, by the degree to which we're moving this agenda forwards practically at the moment, actually to deliver faster development and scale development so that we can actually see vaccines get to people as quickly as possible. And my concern at the moment is, that we absolutely have to have the fullest possible collaboration from people that can do this fast and at scale. We need to get this vaccines as quickly as possible every month. In terms of the costs economically globally, I think we're looking at potentially reductions of around 2% in GDP in some countries. So every month that we don't do this, the impacts are huge. That's true in developed countries. It's particularly true in Africa and in countries where there are poor social safety nets, where people who are in lockdown, on a day-to-day basis are not able to feed themselves, who are not getting access to the services that are being disrupted by this. So we can't afford to wait. We have to have that collaboration now. And things that potentially get in the way of that actually are going to be, unhelpful in actually coming together and doing this. I've come back to the AstraZeneca deal. The AstraZeneca deal is a hugely innovative deal with Serum Institute right off the start gun, and with the commitments around global vaccine access, 1.3 billion doses within 12 months. And that's unheard of. And we need more of that kind of collaboration, and we need to make sure.
Terribly sorry, Saul, I'm going to have to stop you. We're going to get taken off the air any minute, I think. But thank you very much for that.
I'm so sorry for being late.
No, you couldn't help that. But it is, by the way, this is recorded and it's on the website of
Okay.
AEPI. Right, so Simon, you want to.
Well, yeah, thank you, David. I mean, I would like to say, first of all, that I think this has been an exercise in holding governments to account, and indeed in holding international organizations, or effectively public-private partnerships, to account on this issue. And that has been sorely lacking in a lot of the debate around vaccines historically, and indeed more recently on COVID. So I think we are an example of what a parliamentarian's organization should be, in this case, on a webcast. But you would like to see that level of transparency and scrutiny brought forward in parliaments. And I think Ellen gave the best example of that when she said that, in fact, the Dutch wouldn't have joined CTAP, which is the most promising clearly the most promising of the global initiatives, if their parliament hadn't held the government to account. So it sounds like an idea which should be taken for granted, but it isn't always, that parliaments have a role, a functional role of accountability, even during times of strong executives, and that they can do something as progressive as that in a recent example. I would say in our discussion, we didn't perhaps talk about the political economy of vaccine developments and indeed treatment developments as much as we might have. The point has been made by Andrew Hill at the University of Liverpool that these treatments should really cost $1 a dose. And his team have shown the evidence of that, and they've academically produced the evidence to show that. So therefore, when vaccines come onto market through Gavi or otherwise at $10 a day, there's something wrong there, and there needs to be more accountability and transparency at that point. But overall, I think the discussion has advanced this question greatly. And I think it's shown that there's a lot more work to be done to cut through the rhetoric of the announcements that we've heard, these global leadership announcements made by heads of state with great fanfare. We're now a lot closer to what they actually mean. So I think it's time to thank all the panelists for doing that and bringing us forward in that context.
Thank you very much, Simon. You nearly did my job for me, but you didn't get quite the chance. Can I just thank you personally, all of you? It's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope that our audience have taken as much from this as I have. I hope you'll follow up developments that we've been discussing today. There will be an opportunity, as I said, to review and the discussion by the recording that's on the website. So it just needs for me to say that we're going to have another discussion next Monday on the future of trade after COVID-19. And hopefully our audience will want to join us then. But for me personally, thank you all for a fascinating time. We overcame a lot of difficulties in the meantime, but I think nevertheless, it's something that we can put on record as quite an interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Apologies for being late again.
Oh, that's all right.